Echo of Death, a Tom and Scott mystery, fifth book in the series. By Mark Richard Zubro, publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York, narrator, Eric Ost. Acknowledgements. For their kind help and patience, Barb D'Amato, Hugh Holton, Rick Paul, and Kathy Pekaiser Reed. Chapter 2. Pitch black. Midnight on the ocean. Negative on the hand in front of your face, too. I felt Scott's palm against my chest. Hold it! I at least saw that we've got a flight of stairs here. Be careful, Scott said. I inched forward, found the step, and started down. Scott was on my right with my left hand. I felt the cool brick wall. We had carefully clambered down 25 stairs when the door above swung open. The glow wasn't very bright, and we had been deprived of light for only a short while, so our eyes didn't wince the new light. It let us see enough to dash a few more steps to the bottom of what was a narrow set of stairs. An opening at the bottom turned abruptly to the left, and we found one more set of stairs. In the shadowy light, with the sound of footsteps pounding behind us, we fled down again. At the bottom were two passageways, both opening into total blackness. I grabbed the sleeve of his shirt and pulled him toward the opening on the left. No shouts or gunshots followed. I listened as we hurried along. I heard no sounds of pursuit. Perhaps they hadn't been close enough to see which way we took, and now they would be as blind as we were. As the dim glow behind us rapidly dwindled, I slowed slightly to breathe more easily. I didn't want to trip over something as the light failed. I don't know how much more of this I could take, Scott said. His voice reverberated in the passage. Hush, I said, and needed to say no more. He'd heard the echo of his own voice as well as I. We paced rapidly until the light behind us was the size of a pinprick. I held out a hand for Scott to stop. I slumped against the wall on my left and listened to the two of us breathe. Not another sound came from anywhere. Are they following us? Scott asked. I blinked back to where the last vestige of a gleam had been. I couldn't tell whether the pinprick of illumination swayed as a light would if carried by someone, or whether it was simply a light at the beginning of the tunnel. I don't know, I said. I let myself pant for another minute, ears straining for any sound of movement behind us. Where are we? Scott asked. Don't know. I heard his breathing begin to become more even. Despite the rapidity of our progress and the fast-fading light, I managed to take some note of our temporary place of existence. The floor and walls of the passage we were in were cement. The floor was damp with frequent puddles of water that we plowed through. Each side curved to meet about a foot or so above our heads. Several sizes of pipe ran along the roof. We could walk or run side by side. Each outside elbow would scrape against a wall. The exact center of the tunnel gave us plenty of vertical room. Because we were moving side by side, our heads nearly scraped the sides of the excavation. The air felt cold and damp, but there was no wind. Awful dark, Scott said. Unless they've got flashlights, it works against them and for us, I think. Maybe they took the other turn, Scott said. I don't know if they saw which way we went. If we're lucky, they didn't. My breathing wasn't back to normal yet, but I whispered, I don't want to stop here any longer. I think we should keep going forward. This has got to lead somewhere. I hope, Scott said. We pushed forward, and in a moment all vestige of possible light was gone. We tried to keep our footing silent, but I was still in my dress shoes, and they clicked with what was probably a minor tap, but which, after a time, I thought was firecracker loudness. Scott had dressed far more casually than I for the fundraiser, which meant he'd worn chinos, a pale yellow shirt, blue blazer, and brown dress shoes. He still wore everything except the blazer. Our steps became more hesitant as we went along. So far, we hadn't run into any obstructions, but I had no idea whether sudden openings would gape in the floor or whether we'd run into a flight of stairs. In a short while, we were slowly groping forward with feet and fingers extended ahead and to the side of us. Careful as our movements were, we still managed occasionally to dislodge what I guessed to be small stones or pieces of wood. They echoed slightly, but we could hardly help running into them. So far, no creepy critters or crawly insects had decided to make their presence known. The place smelled as if someone hadn't emptied their cat litter box in years. At one point, I tried counting the number of paces we took, but gave it up. After a couple of hundred, certainly we were traveling some distance. The tunnel seemed to go on straight. If we needed to go back, it wouldn't matter how far we walked. We could just turn around. I couldn't see the face on my watch, so I don't know how long it was after I stopped counting when Scott said, "I'm scared." "Me too," I said. We felt our way forward for a few more steps. Then Scott said, "I'm sorry about bringing Glenn into the house. You were right. He was into something awful. It's my fault we're in this." I wanted to say, "I told you so, and you should have listened," but this was not the time. When we were safe again, I could indulge in my frustrations. I muttered a non-committal, "It's okay." If we decided to compare our insights or lack thereof about mutual acquaintances, although none of mine had gone this spectacularly wrong, Scott could remind me about our problem with the dwarf, the psychic, and the buffalo 5 years ago, when we encountered the above-mentioned at the height of the worst monsoon storm in Bombay in 30 years. All I had to do that day was agree to stay in the hotel room until afternoon. My insistence on going out had led to a classic disaster. Memory could never blur the sheer terror of the events that followed, but in my opinion, it hadn't been nearly as life-threatening as this. At the present moment, I didn't want to stop and ask Scott's opinion of that escapade. We fumbled onward for a time. Occasionally, his right and my left arm, shoulders, or knees bumped together. After one such movement, I felt Scott's hand slip into mine. I drew immense comfort from that closeness. I on the right, using my right arm, he on the left, using his left, groped our way along the wall. Hand in hand, we shuffled forward. Our progress felt glacial, but although nothing sounded behind us, my fear began to grow. I'd never had trouble with claustrophobia before, but being this far underground with fear behind us and uncertainty ahead, I was upset big time. Without Scott's presence, I don't know how I would have managed. Scott said, "I think there's a light ahead." We stopped. "You're right," I muttered. Scott asked the obvious question. "What could it be?" "I don't know, but we'd better be careful until we're sure." "They couldn't get ahead of us?" Scott asked. "If they've got lights, they could, and if the opening we didn't take eventually led this way." It took several moments for the pinprick of light ahead to swell to the size of a baseball, but its glow barely penetrated to our position. It began to look like a miniature train engine, light bobbing in the distance. I halted for a moment, then my good sense chased away the irrational thought that it was a train. There were no rails under our feet, and any sound of thundering wheels would have echoed throughout the tunnel. "Should we go back?" Scott whispered. "We know for sure they're behind us, somewhere," I murmured. "We've got to try forward." Cupping my hands around my mouth and placing my lips against his ear, I explained to Scott how we needed to move. I felt his ear brush against my lip as he nodded that he understood. Each footfall now became a slow-motion quest for noiselessness. We raised each foot deliberately off the floor, moved it several inches further down the hall, then placed it slowly into nothingness until it touched the concrete with less than a feather's murmur. The gleam from the front of us had ceased to move. Perhaps my eyes had played tricks on me and the light had never moved, or maybe it was just my fears that had made it seem to bob and weave. Around 50 feet from the source of the illumination, I touched Scott's shoulder. He stopped. I wanted to do a lot more observing and evaluating before moving closer. What had seemed like the glow from a 1,000-watt bulb I now guessed must be the feeble glimmer from a rapidly fading flashlight. We heard voices barely kept low. "Are you sure we're ahead of them?" a baritone voice asked. A tenor responded, "They don't have a light. They have to be moving carefully." "Maybe they just ran," baritone said. "They could be past us," he insisted. "Not possible. With a light, we could move much faster, and this was the first junction." "Maybe they found another junction somewhere on their side that led off in another direction. We had one." Baritone's deep voice had an unattractive whine mixed in with it. "I say we stay here," Tenor said. The other guys said they'd go back for more flashlights and follow the other passageway. If there's another turn, we'll get more men. Those two guys will be trapped between us and them. Obviously, we couldn't simply outwit them. Reinforcements would be coming and we'd be stuck. I could make out only the outlines of shadows leaning against the far wall. I could attach no face or feature to their floating voices. "I don't like it," Baritone said. "You want to start going against my decisions?" Tenor voice asked. Baritone added a bit of sullen to his whine. "No, I just don't like being this far underground, and these tunnels flooded once before." Now I knew where we were. On April 13th, 1992, tons of water broke through the walls of the tunnel system that runs under Chicago's Loop. Water had gushed from the Chicago River into the basements and sub-basements of hundreds of buildings. The water used the old tunnel system as a conduit for its flow. The tunnels built between 1899 and 1909 originally were a roadway for small electric trains making deliveries, usually coal, to Loop buildings. The train company went bust in the 1950s, and then in the 1970s, utility companies began using the tunnels instead of digging up city streets to lay cable. Most of the rails had been cemented over. The city planned to install bulkheads and steel doors to seal off tunnel sections under the river to prevent any further flooding, but in such a way as to let the advanced technology of the future still use the old system. I remembered that there had been more than 50 miles of tunnels. The first shaft had been sunk in the basement of a saloon at 165 West Madison Street. Concrete had been applied along the walls to give them a smooth, finished appearance. Generally, the opening was 6 foot 9 inches wide and 7 foot 6 inches high. Our temporary refuge had been created out of the blue clay under the city decades ago. We must have been at or near the furthest terminus on the north side of the Chicago River. I hesitated. The silence between the two of them deepened. I figured better to try something sooner than later. Baritone broke the silence abruptly. "You think those guys in the underground garage would have more than one stupid flashlight with crappy batteries? I hope they don't run out before the other guys get here. I don't want to wait in the darkness so they can jump us. Those two assholes are probably down here watching us. Why do we have to catch them anyway? Let's just kill them and be done with it." "Why don't you shut up?" Tenor asked. Baritone grumbled a little more, but basically did as requested. At this point, I figured out why the flashlight didn't move or waver. They'd placed it on a small outcropping halfway up the wall. While Baritone had been talking, I began lowering myself to a squatting position and slowly began to run my hand along the floor, hunting for an article to toss beyond them to distract them. An old trick, but if it worked, I wasn't going to worry about being saved by the cliché. I hope Scott didn't try to squat as I was. His knees tended to pop like cracked knuckles. That kind of noise from a mile away that would start a herd of buffalo stampeding. Much less alert R2 antagonist in this situation. I found nothing in the immediate vicinity of my shoes. I raised my foot and took one careful duck walk forward. Scott tapped my shoulder and almost unbalanced me. I looked up at him, but I could barely make out the gleam of his eyes. He pointed back the way we had come. A pinprick of light glowed in the distance. I fumbled more quickly for some object to throw. Scott tapped my shoulder again. I wanted to shout, "What?" He pointed to his other hand. I moved my eyes closed and saw the faint gleam of several coins. Obviously, our minds had thought along the same lines, only his worked a bit more logically than mine at the moment. I felt stupid for not thinking of checking my pockets, but grateful that he had. I touched the front of my pants. I had my keys in one pocket and what felt like several quarters in another. I also had my wallet in my back pocket. It could serve if necessary. I glanced back at the ever-growing light behind us, now the size of a $50. If the guys ahead of us saw it, we'd be in trouble. I unbent each body part as carefully and quickly as I could and stood up. Scott reared back his right arm to toss his handful of coins. I grabbed his hand to stop him. If he threw the whole handful, they could travel in random directions. It wouldn't do to have an object whiz by from our direction. I wanted the coin to land beyond them. I held Scott's arm to keep him from throwing and took one of my coins carefully, I stretched my hand above my head. I touched the top of the tunnel before my arm was fully extended. I couldn't pitch them overhead. I lowered my arm to waist high, pulled it back, let it shoot forward, and heaved the coined sidearm down the tunnel. The two men performed to perfection. They leaped up, grabbed the flashlight, and pointed it away from us, first down the tunnel we'd been traversing, then down the other. "What the hell was that?" Baritone asked. "I don't like this." "They're around here somewhere." I could tell now that Tenor held the flashlight. He began to swing it back in our direction. Baritone raised a hand and fired down the tunnel where the sound had come from. The report echoed and thundered. We were still too far away to rush them under cover of the noise of the gunshot, but we crept forward slowly. Tenor's hand with the flashlight swung back away from us. "Stop that," he said. "Orders were no shooting, at least not yet." "I'll defend myself," Baritone said. When one of them had said, "Catch them," earlier, I thought perhaps they'd been told not to shoot. This new comment confirmed that possibility and gave me some comfort. Baritone continued, "I'm not going to get caught. I'll kill them first." "Shut up," Tenor said. I hoped they would keep talking to cover the sound of our approaching footfalls. We were 10 feet behind them when the figure with the flashlight looked back. "There's light behind us." "The guys were coming," the deep voice said. "Someone else is there," Tenor said. "Now," I muttered. We rushed them. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Scott drive for the Tenor and grab for the hand with the light. The beam wobbled and swung erratically. I jumped toward the hand with the gun, which Baritone had begun to raise. My Marine training proved to be not all for naught. I slammed his hand against the wall. A shot blasted the darkness. My ears rang. He still gripped the gun. I hoped the shots wouldn't cause a cave-in. The tunnel behind us echoed with shouts. I wrapped both hands around Baritone's arm and tried to bang the wrist or fingers against the wall. He tried to bite me. I twisted around and managed to get an elbow under his jaw and knock him back a few feet. I'd spun around and was now facing back the way we'd come. At least 3 separate bright lights bobbed closer. Adrenaline poured into my body. I threw my whole weight behind smashing the hand with the gun against the wall. Metal clacked against the cement. I got an arm loose and smashed the heel of my palm up against the bridge of his nose. He crumpled to the ground, and I heard whimpering in the baritone range. I whirled to find Scott, still locked in combat with Tenor. I grabbed the back of Tenor's hair and twisted and pulled back, then rammed his head nose first against the wall. He dropped the flashlight, met the floor, and stayed there. Voices called behind us. I grabbed the gun off the floor, and Scott snatched up the flashlight. Not much time to decide which tunnel. Scott leaped toward the opening leading to the intersection passage and turned right, further into the tunnel. He was moving, and I had no time to agree or disagree. No good to try going back. I followed him. As my butt cleared the entrance, I heard shots ring out. Into the ensuing silence, Baritone yelled, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot! You might hit us!" A few precious seconds gained in the confusion and silence had the decision not to shoot been changed. I didn't bother debating the safety of falling into a deadfall well or cavern. We couldn't use the flashlight. It might light our way, but it would also make us great targets with them close behind. "Run!" I yelled. I felt more than saw the shadow of Scott's body speeding beside me. I heard the material on my shirt scrape against the wall as my arms pumped furiously. I glanced back once and saw a light flashing around a corner. I didn't slacken my pace, but I fired 2 rounds at random behind me. The 2 flashes from the gun gave a brief burst of light, but the roar of the firing made an incredible din. I didn't care whether I hit anything. I just wanted to scare them into not following, or at least hesitating, because now we were armed as well. It didn't work. Out of the threatening darkness behind us, a fusillade of bullets thundered and echoed through the tunnel. I dived into Scott, shoved him to the floor, and covered him with my body. Bullets rained for 15 or 20 seconds. I felt a few faint bits of dust drift into my cheek from where a bullet must have hit the ceiling above. My right arm and shoulder got soaked from a puddle of water. "Are you hit?" I whispered in the echoing din. "I'm okay," Scott muttered. "We can't stay here," I said. "They'll simply come for us. We've got to run." I heard his mumbled agreement. Now, I whispered. We rose. I said, keep as close to the sides as you can. I didn't want to fire again because the tracings from my gunshots I now realized had shown them where to fire. As I ran, I tried rationalizing my not thinking about our being targets, but quickly gave it up amid the desire to keep air flowing into my lungs and the growing fear that I would plow into something or trip and break a vital limb, leaving myself to the mercy of whoever had killed Glenn. I turned my head back for a second. No lights behind us. Maybe at least one of them had figured out that their lights presented a target for us to shoot at as well. Down the tunnel we fled, reckless in our fear. Our narrow confines allowed the sounds of pursuit from behind to echo and re-echo, making it seem at times as if our hunters were inches behind us. Suddenly the tunnel began to slope down. Then lack of wall touching my elbow and a sense of spaciousness on either side made me aware that we were at a junction. I reached out for Scott. "Which way?" he whispered. His words seemed as loud as the last trumpet on Judgment Day. If I remembered the general idea of the tunnels from all the flood stories, they moved generally west and south from where we were. If we had been traveling south, then we certainly didn't want to take the left-hand opening, which would lead toward the lake. The tunnels dead-ended or turned back upon themselves before reaching Lake Michigan. Not a lot of time to choose. "Right," I said. "At least we'll be out of any line of fire if they decide to start shooting again." "What if that tunnel that was paralleling ours comes out not near here?" Scott asked. "Some of them could have followed it and used lights. They could have leapfrogged ahead of us and be to our right." "Then straight ahead. No more time to argue. Let's move." The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, so we employed more care. Now, as we rushed forward, the tunnel floor continued to slope downward, apparently for the trip under the river. Vision of tons of water breaking through and trapping and drowning us popped into my head. Supposedly, the city was making more inspections, and bulkheads were being installed to prevent another flood, like last time, which brought another unbidden thought. What if they already had installed the bulkheads along here, and we were rushing headlong into a trap no matter which branching we took? At least now I had a gun. Maybe we could hole up in some obscure cranny. Probably couldn't hold out long. No one knew where we were. I didn't know how often they inspected or whether they workers on the bulkheads put in overtime on weekends. We came to another crossing and hesitated, then whirled around uncertainly. I listened for a few moments. Not even an echo pursued us. Maybe we were outdistancing them. I put my arm out to point it forward and touched metal. Another couple of steps and we'd have run into a bulkhead. To the left was the lake. We took the right-hand turn. The aroma of a cat litter box had been slowly turning into that of a monkey house, which desperately needed cleaning. Now, that stench of unwashed cages began to overpower us. "I think we'd better try the light," Scott said. "It's not too dangerous?" I asked. "Whatever is making that stink is more dangerous than what's behind us." "Listen," he said. Silence impenetrable fell. I strained to listen, then I caught a light, skittering, screechy noise. Scott switched on the light. At first we couldn't see anything, but we walked forward slowly. Another 50 feet, and at the far edge of the glow from the light, I thought I caught a glimpse of a moving carpet of gray. We stopped. Hundreds, maybe thousands of verminous creatures barred our way. I stifled my impulse to turn and run. Scott played the light along the walls. We could see a faint crack through which the animal seemed to move. About 40 feet further along was another junction. "Will they attack us?" I asked. "Not if we keep moving. We aren't going to try and walk through them." "No, but we can't go back. Let's try for that junction." Going back was useless. Going close to rats was our only hope. We began inching forward. "We haven't met many so far," I murmured. "I think all the boarding up of exits has taken away their food supply. They won't stay any place that has no food." We proceeded at a slow, steady pace. "I think they're frightened of the light," Scott said. Perhaps it was my imagination, or the dimness, or the fall of the light that made these critters seem to be the size of the proverbial Toyota. I knew this wasn't the environment in which either of us wanted to meet the vermin elite. We turned the corner we'd seen and moved away from the rats. I felt a shiver through my body. When we finally turned off the light, we had to save the battery. Slowly, the smell began less overpowering. After a while, I put the gun in my belt. I could hear Scott and touch him, but I desperately wanted to see him, his facial expressions as he talked, the cleft of his chin, the gleam in his eyes. When he was about to make me laugh, his broad shoulders, the tiny cone-shaped mole just below his butt on his left leg. We strode forward while holding out our hands in front of our bodies. An eerie length of time later, I touched solid metal on my right. "Turn on the flashlight," I said. Scott whirled the beam around and caught a shadow to the left. I moved up to examine it. Metal rungs, narrow and rusted. He played the beam upward. The glorious steps led into darkness, but it was up, not forward. I leaped toward the bottom rung. I bumped against Scott. The flashlight fell and winked out. I tried to grab it, missed the step, and sprawled forward, banging my head on the cement. "You okay?" Scott called. Moments later, I felt his hands touching my left arm. "I'm fine," I said. I tapped my hand on the ground to find the flashlight. I could feel Scott next to me doing the same. "Got it," he said a minute later. "Turn it on," I ordered. "I'm trying to. I think it's broken." I felt stupid for screwing up and now giving commands. Of course, he would try to turn it on. When the light didn't reappear immediately, I got truly frightened. "It's not going to work," I said. "It's my fault. I'm sorry." "Forget it." I heard the clunk of metal on cement and then the roll of the flashlight. "Did you throw it away?" I asked. "It's broken," Scott said. "We can't fix it." I was torn between yelling at him for flinging it away and feelings of guilt for causing him to drop it in the first place. "Let's try to find the rungs," Scott said. We stepped close to each other and then began moving to the sides, touching every inch of wall. I didn't say anything about if this way was blocked above, that we should have kept the flashlight and maybe tried to fix it. How would we anyway in total darkness? I groped along the wall for a few minutes. Suddenly my hand touched metal. I called Scott. When I felt him next to me, I reached for his hand and brought it to the metal. "I'll climb first," I said. "Probably be good if you stick right behind me." "Yeah," he said. I had seen a narrow railing on each side before he dropped the light. Now I clutched each of these and began my ascent. Several times the stairs turned through narrow openings, but up I climbed, listening to Scott moving below me. After maybe 30 steps, I saw it. "Light ahead," I shouted. It didn't seem like daylight, and it was faint, but in that darkness it might as well have been the blaze of the sun. Maybe 20 more steps, and I could see that the light came from various pinprick-sized holes in a round object. Dim as it was, at least I could see. "It's like some kind of manhole cover," I announced to Scott when I arrived near the top. The steps continued to the covering. I grabbed hold of one railing with my left hand and banged the other against the manhole. It didn't budge. I could see that the opening we were in was big enough for 3 people to stand next to each other if there had been a floor. "What's wrong?" Scott asked. "It won't move," I said. I examined the blockage carefully. 2 hinges held the left side of the cover, but I couldn't find any other protuberances. The lock would be on the side away from us. I pulled the gun out of my belt. "You're not going to shoot?" Scott said. I turned the gun around and held it by the barrel. "No," I said as I began banging away at the pins, holding a hinge. I knew the sound of the gun being fired in this narrow place would deafen us, perhaps leaving permanent damage. I tapped at it vigorously, but it wouldn't budge. I gripped the railing carefully with one hand, planted one foot on the rung, and found a hold for the other on the opposite wall. I swung hard. Nothing. I summoned a reserve of strength and whammed it. A quarter-inch movement, but enough for a huge surge of hope. A few minutes' work, and it was gone. The second proved even more recalcitrant, but with a last swing, the gun butt cracked and the pin flew into the darkness below. I shoved at the lid. It scraped open. I clambered up and onto a floor, turned around, knelt down, and gave Scott a hand up. We were inside a small room. The light came from an opaque fixture which glowed yellow above a sign that said, "Danger, wear your hard hat." By the light, I could see mounds of thick cables connected to banks of switches on all the walls. I took a step toward the door. It flew open. Framed against the blackness of night was a well-fed man who said, "What the hell are you doing here?" Turned out we were in the middle of an electrical substation. a few feet north and under the merchandise mart. We explained everything twice to him, then to several electric company officials, and finally to the police. Most of them instantly recognized Scott Carpenter, the baseball player. You win more than a few Series games and make millions a year, people in Chicago will take notice. They barely took notice of me as Tom Mason, non-famous person. At this moment, their recognition of him and the goodwill it brought were very good things. Somebody asked whether we wanted food. We said no. It was a little after 5 in the morning. Our news about a murder at Scott's place kept any fawning and good fellowship on the part of the police to a minimum. We rode to the penthouse in the back of an unmarked car. Numerous other police joined us in the lobby of Scott's building. Howard wasn't on duty. The morning guard told us that she hadn't seen anything strange and that when she took over, Howard had acted normal. The cops, led by a slender detective, maybe in his mid-40s, with a hatchet face and a long nose, whose name was Joe Quinn, insisted that we give them the key and that they go up ahead of us. 2 plainclothes cops and 2 uniforms took the journey to the penthouse. 15 minutes later, the 2 detectives came down with strange looks on their faces. "Are you guys shitting us?" Quinn asked. "What's wrong?" I asked. He crooked his finger at us to follow him. We gathered on the elevator as we rode up. I asked, "What's going on?" "You're going to tell us." "We didn't kill him," Scott said. Quinn said nothing. At the door, the uniformed officer gave us an odd look. We hurried inside. The body was gone. We rushed over to the windows. Only a small rust-colored stain remained to mark the spot of Glenn Proctor's demise. Scott and I gaped at each other, then turned to face the police. "He was here," Scott said. "I swear to God." Something truly outre had happened, and I was angry, but a granite mass of fear rested at the pit of my stomach. I knelt down and felt the rug. It was slightly damp. "This could be his blood," I said. "Or not," Quinn said. "Why would we make this up?" Scott asked. "I don't know," Quinn said. "Maybe you could tell us. We don't need this kind of shit. We've got plenty of real cases to deal with, not this crap." "Look," I said, "we didn't make it up. There was a dead guy here. Glenn Proctor, the baseball player. He just got in from Mexico. You could call down there to the team or check the airlines. He came here. Call his parents home. They live in the area. Check with Howard, the night security man. He might have seen the guys who were after us." Quinn growled. Jess Balowski, his partner, a guy with thinning hair that he combed straight back in lonely strands, said, "We could make a couple of calls. You better hope some part of this checks out." "His luggage is in the bedroom," I said. "I'll show you." Balowski followed me down the hall to the room Proctor had been staying in. All of his things were gone. The room looked as if a cleaning service had been through it. I checked the bathroom he'd been using. Totally spotless. "Why are you guys doing this?" the cop asked. "We aren't doing anything," I said. "It really happened. I saw it. I touched him." Back in the living room, Quinn was on the phone. I listened to his half of the conversation. "We got no dead body." "I don't know yet." "Don't strike me as the hysterical type." "We'll get to the bottom of it." He hung up. "No luggage," Balowski told his partner. I was angry, confused, and frightened. "The ability to move that quickly and cover their tracks means it's a big-time outfit," I said. Balowski said, "You're saying that some nasty people killed him," left, then said, "Oh gosh, let's not leave our mess to clean up," and hurried back here to neaten the place? "No," I snapped. A few moments' silence passed before Quinn asked, "Anybody else see Proctor here?" We shook our heads. He'd gotten in late Friday. Scott said he hadn't gone out or called anyone. "At least make the calls," I suggested. I said, "We have no reason to lie to you." Quinn agreed to try calling. We sat on the white leather couches in the living room. "What airline?" Quinn asked. "He told us he flew Air Mexico," Scott said. The detective called the airline, identified himself, and told the person on the other end what he needed. From what he said, I gathered he was being put through to a supervisor. Quinn turned his body and said, "Tough finding someone to give me information this early in the morning." Eventually, he was connected. The significant part came when he said, "No record? You're sure?" He listened a minute more, thanked the person, and then turned to us. "You sure he was on Air Mexico?" Quinn asked. "That's what he told us," Scott said. "They have no record of him being on any plane, and to make an international flight, you have to show your passport." "Are you saying he had a fake passport?" "I don't know," I said. "We just tell you what he told us. Can't you check the other airlines?" "Yeah, but it'll take a while." "Why would this guy lie to you?" Quinn asked. "He told us he was in trouble," I said. "What kind of trouble?" the cop asked. "He didn't say." "You let him stay here without knowing what was going on?" "He was a friend," Scott said. "He told me he'd explain, but that he just needed a place to stay, and could we put him up? He's a good friend. I trusted him." "Isn't he the baseball player that's been suspended for drugs?" Balowski asked. "Yes," I said. Quinn made another call. "I need the number for Proctor, either in 708 or 312. Area code," he said into the receiver. "The real estate guy. Try the North Shore first." He jotted a few numbers on paper in his regulation blue notebook. He punched in the number. He had to wait some time for an answer. He stood up and, trailing the 40-foot cord, paced the length of the room in front of the floor to ceiling windows. When someone answered, he stopped, walking. Quinn identified himself and asked for Mr. Proctor. After a lengthy pause, he again identified himself, then asked if Glenn Proctor was there or if they knew where he was. Several minutes of conversation followed. When he was finished, Quinn came back and sat across from us. "I haven't heard from him," he said. "As far as they know, he's in Mexico getting ready for or making contact for winter baseball. He is supposed to be doing some traveling down there at the moment. He could be anywhere in the country. We could call the team tomorrow and see if they've seen him or have any guess as to where he might be. Confirming his whereabouts won't be easy." Interviewing Howard, the security man, necessitated rousing building management and more lengthy explanations, but after a final phone call, Quinn said, "He didn't see a thing out of the ordinary. One too many naps, or they got to him," Scott said. "Glenn Proctor was here," I said. "He had 2 bullet holes in him. One was..." Quinn cut me off. "What do you want us to do? Say we buy your story. What could we do? We don't have a corpse. Tough to prove a murder without a body. Okay, you saw it. But where is it? You don't just tootle around the city with a dead body draped over your shoulder." "The guys who work in the parking garage," I said. "They must have seen something." Quinn directed one of the uniformed cops to go downstairs and check it out. "Can't you guys get the crime lab up here?" Scott said. "You could take fibers from the carpet. That stain has to prove something." "The crime lab when there isn't a crime?" Balowski made it sound as if we were really dumb and that he was getting truly fed up. "The crime lab comes," Quinn said. "They take samples. Say they find blood. Who's to say it isn't yours or somebody else's? Do you know Proctor's blood type? If they found fibers from a jacket or a piece of clothing, we have only your word that's what Proctor was wearing. If they could track the DNA of what they found, what do you have from Proctor that would show it was his?" "And if we do find evidence," Balowski said, "what's to keep us from thinking either one or both of you killed him?" I thought escaping from the tunnels would be our biggest problem. The cop returned from downstairs. "The guy who was working the parking garage went home after his shift. I called him from downstairs. He says the only thing that happened was after 3 this morning when a couple guys in gray suits came in. Said they were waiting for one of the tenants. The attendant said he had to park a few cars. When he came back, they were gone, and he didn't see them again. Says he didn't see or hear anything suspicious, and no, he wouldn't recognize them again." Balowski glared at us. Quinn said, "Why don't you guys really tell us what this is all about?" Both Scott and I used every argument we could think of to try and convince them. At one point, Quinn said, "It would be a lot easier if you could give us anything tangible to prove your point." Both of us spoke passionately in a desperate attempt to be believed. We even followed the cops down in the elevator as they left, trying to get in a few more words that would tip the scale to get them to believe us. Balowski didn't even want to listen, and he made it evident with elaborate sounds of disgust every time one of us would try to make a telling point. Outside, Balowski immediately hopped into the car. Quinn said, "I promised to do a little checking. This is too screwy. I want to believe you guys." Quinn got in the car and they drove off. One of the uniformed cops edged up to Scott and held out a little notepad. He asked Scott for an autograph for his kid. Almost reflexively, Scott reached out his hand for the pen. I gave a disgusted sigh. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.